Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm It's Robbie Rhino, and in today's video we're going to be looking at a brand new Cold War premium tank to enter World of Tanks console, and that's because there's a brand new season that started today on the 4th of October. The Awakened season has begun, and the level 100 season pass reward tank is an Era 2 medium tank in the form of the T-55 Enigma, and we're going to scroll down here and have a look at this tank. It's an independent Alliance Era 2 medium tank with a fast firing 100mm gun according to Wargaming, so we're going to have to see if that's correct. And you can see here that it's got lots of composite armour on the front and sides of the turret, on the upper plate and on the sides of the tracks, as well as this big slab attached to the back of the turret to protect against heat, HE and ATGM ammunition. So we're going to have to see how well this thing holds up. In today's video we're going to go over all of the stats of this vehicle compared to 3 of its competitors. I'm going to show you the armour profile in the garage of this vehicle, as well as show you 3 gameplays and my commander and equipment setup should you wish to run the T-55 Enigma like I do in the 3 gameplays you'll be viewing at the end. They're all timestamps, so you can skip forward to whatever part you want to look at in this review. So how do you get your hands on this tank? Well, you need to buy the 2,000 or 6,000 gold season pass and make your way to level 100, and you'll be able to pick up this tank. But we're going to head over here to this Excel spreadsheet where we're going to compare the T-55 Enigma to the T-62 M1, the Super M48 and the Type 82. You can see that the first 3 here are highlighted in a light yellow to say that they are premium tanks, and the Type 82 is a tech tree vehicle. Why have I chosen these 3 tanks to compare to the T-55 Enigma? Well, they're comparable as they're medium tanks. They have some armour, and especially in the case of the Super M48, pretty damn good turret armour, and they are also comparable in the case of the T-62 M1 and Type 82 because they are low profile medium tanks with pretty bad gun depression. So we're going to go over all of the stats here in this Excel spreadsheet. If you haven't seen me do one of these before, then green is the best stat, red's the worst, and orange is somewhere in between, and the ones highlighted in bright yellow are the commander and equipment setup stats applied to the base stats of the T-55 Enigma, but I'll walk you through that in just a little bit. So as it's a premium tank, we're going to start off here with the bonuses of the T-55 Enigma. You get a 10% XP bonus, a 10% commander XP bonus, and a 65% silver bonus. The 10% is the same as the T-62 M1 and the Super M48. The commander XP is the joint worst in this comparison by 15% compared to the Super M48, but it does have the joint best silver bonus at 65%, which is 15% better than the Super M48, so you're trading off your commander XP for your silver bonus, and 65% is a big bonus. This does make a lot of silver indeed. And now we're going to get into the raw stats of these tanks, starting with the hit points. So the T-55 Enigma has 2,800 hit points, which is getting towards the 3,000, 3,100 hit point level, which is the most you're going to get in Era 2 of the Cold War game mode. It's joint best in this comparison with the Super M48, which has 50 hit points more, and it's better than the T-62 M1 and the Type 82, which are the worst in this comparison. So a nice healthy chunk of hit points for this well-armoured medium tank. In terms of its view range, then 495 meters, it is the worst in this comparison, joint with the Type 82, but not by a long way, and you can boost that up with the commander and equipment setup that I use. However, this is a brawling medium tank, and it doesn't matter too much, especially with the True Vision system. And now we're going to look at the mobility of the T-55 Enigma, and it doesn't look too good because a lot of this is highlighted in red and orange, meaning it's either middle of the road or worst in class. You have a 580 horsepower engine, 14.36 power to weight ratio, 57.9 kilometers an hour forwards, 22.5 kilometers an hour in reverse, a 44 degrees a second hold traverse, and a 28 degrees a second turret traverse. In this comparison, you can see that the Type 82 is the best, with everything best in class here on the right, but the rest of them are pretty comparable, with the Enigma being the worst with its power to weight ratio and sort of similar top forward speeds. It does have a pretty nice reverse speed at 22.5 kilometers an hour, which means you can get out of harm's way a little bit faster than in something like the T-62 M1, and one thing to watch out for is the turret traverse, which is pretty poor at 28 degrees a second. You do boost that up with the commander and equipment setup I use, but it still is 16 degrees a second slower than the hull traverse, which means that when you're trying to catch up your gun with tanks that are circling you, you definitely have to free aim. You have to move your hull and the turret at the same time, and it can be a little bit tricky on some of the smaller profile light tanks like the Armadillo to catch up those little pests, but that's something to watch out for. But pretty comparable to the other tanks that have good frontal armour like the Super M48 and a little bit of armour on the T-62 M1 as well. The mobility is pretty poor, so you're going to want to do everything you can to boost that up, and I'll tell you how I do that in just a little bit when we speak about the commander and equipment setup. But now we're going to get onto the guns of these tanks, and the T-55 Enigma has the 100mm gun, the T-62 M1 has a 115mm gun, the Super M48 has a 105mm gun, as does the Type AT2. So the T-55 Enigma fires APF SDS as standard, heat as premium ammunition, and HE as its third ammunition choice. The APF SDS rounds and the heat rounds do 440 alpha damage, and the HE rounds do 580 alpha damage. The penetration on the APF SDS rounds is 376mm of penetration, on the heat rounds it's 405mm of penetration, and on the HE it's 135mm of penetration. And in terms of the shell velocities, 1430 meters a second on the standard APF SDS rounds, and on the heated HE it's 900 meters a second. You can see here that although the APF SDS is worst in class compared to the T-62 M1, which has 1650 meters a second, it's quite comparable to the Super M48 and the Type 82, and 1430 meters a second is more than enough to fire at mid to long ranges. Just bear in mind that you will lose penetration over distance, whereas you won't with the heat rounds, but they do have a much slower shell velocity at 900 meters a second, meaning they're harder to hit at mid to long ranges, but they can be used at sort of mid to short ranges. However, heat rounds do get absorbed by all of the composite armour and the spaced armour in Era 2 of the Cold War game mode, so I run full APF SDS rounds, as the HE rounds are largely useless. They do have the best in class shell velocity. Penetration 135mm is very hard to use in Era 2 of the Cold War game mode, and it does jump up your damage, but I definitely recommend carrying as many APF SDS rounds as you can, because it is fast firing and you might run out with 43 rounds of ammunition. In terms of its penetration values, it's pretty poor on the T-55 Enigma. You're trading your mobility and your penetration values and alpha damage for DPM and for your gun handling basically, and your armor. 376mm on your standard rounds is pretty poor when you compare to the rest of the tanks in this comparison that have 420 to 449mm of penetration, and on the heat rounds 405 is still pretty poor, and it's a lot worse than the 505mm of penetration on the APF SDS rounds on the Super M48, which is its premium ammunition choice. Do bear in mind in this comparison that the T-62 M1 has ATGMs as its third ammunition choice, and the Super M48 has HESH, and the Type 82 has HE, so that's something to bear in mind when we're comparing these guns. But alpha damage is the worst in this comparison because it is a 100mm gun. It's the smaller caliber gun, but it is faster firing with a good DPM, as we'll see in just a little bit. But 440 can feel a little bit underwhelming when you do low roll, so you do have to expose yourself more often than in tanks like the rest in this comparison. That's all about the ammunition choice, I would say. It isn't too bad at all if you just stick to your standard ammunition and you aim for weak spots. Be prepared to bounce with this penetration, but the 1430 meters a second is more than enough at mid to long ranges. And now we get on to the gun handling, and you can see that there's quite a lot of green here, so it's good news for the T-55 Enigma. As it's a lower caliber gun, it's got pretty good DPM and pretty good gun handling. 2 seconds aim time, 0.3 accuracy, 3,472 DPM, which means you have a base reload of 7.6 seconds. You carry 43 rounds of ammunition, 5 degrees of gun depression, and a weird 14.25 degrees of gun elevation. Best in class aim time, accuracy, best in class DPM and the reload at 7.6 seconds can be brought down to a pretty good level, as you'll see here on the right, and I'll talk you through my commander and equipment setup in just a little bit. You can see here that it's got the same aim time as the Super M48 and the Type 82, as well as the same accuracy as the Type 82, much better accuracy than the Super M48. It's got the best DPM by about 100 odd damage per minute, but 3472 can be boosted to a very nice level, as you can see here on the right. 43 rounds of ammunition is pretty low considering you do fire relatively fast, and the things to watch out for is the depression and elevation values, especially the depression. The worst in this comparison is the T-62 M1 with the terrible 3 degrees, but it's not much better for the T-55 Enigma at 5 degrees of gun depression. This is very difficult to use on a lot of ridgelines. You're going to have to find low profile ridgelines to use this kind of gun depression on, and sort of use the environment to your advantage to wedge up your tank to get your gun down on your opponents. And when you're downslope shooting upwards, bear in mind this 14.25 degrees of gun elevation can catch you out, and it's definitely not as good as something like the Super M48 with 9 degrees of depression and 19 degrees of gun elevation. If you hate having low gun depression, you won't like this tank at all. If you can make it work, then you can make the DPM work and you can make a lot of silver, but yeah, if you love your gun depression, you probably won't like this tank. It can be very frustrating to use. So that's it for the stats, or the base stats of the T-55 Enigma and the comparison. I'm now going to go into my commander and equipment setup and tell you what I run as my setup. So in terms of my equipment, I run advanced loader, traction system and advanced powertrain. And in terms of my commander, I run 6th Sense, Born Leader, Rapid Loading, Steady Aim, Rapid Aim, Snapshot, Run and Gun, Armour Angling, and Track Mechanic. In terms of my equipment, I run the loader to improve the DPM, as it's one of the biggest attributes of this tank. And in terms of the traction system and powertrain, I run the mobility equipment, both pieces, because I want to improve that poor mobility to get into position, keep my armor facing my opponents, and to traverse some of the terrain on the wide open maps and try and get out of trouble as quickly as possible. And in terms of my commander, all of the gun handling perks to help the gun handling, as it's one of the biggest features, like the DPM and the armor of this tank. Armor angling, as I'm going to be brawling in this tank and I want to reduce the amount of damage I'm taking. And track mechanic, because I want to get my tracks on. I'm going to be brawling, I'm going to be getting tracked. I want to get off of ridge lines when I get tracked using my 5 degrees of gun depression. I don't want to be sat up there with my tracks in the air and not able to shoot anyone with the poor gun depression. So I run track mechanic to get my tracks on as quickly as possible. So what does that do to the stats of the T-55 Enigma? Well, it gives me a 516 meters view range. It now gives me a 609 horsepower engine with a 15.08 power to weight ratio, a 66.87 kilometers an hour top speed, 26 kilometers an hour top reverse speed, 48.4 degrees a second hold reverse, and a 32.42 degrees a second turret reverse. Bear in mind that's still 16 degrees a second worse than your hold reverse, so when you're trying to catch up with tanks that are circling you, you want to move your hull and turret at the same time, give plenty of lead and go into sniper view and use the free aim, and definitely not auto aim because you won't hit your targets. But that 26 kilometers an hour reverse speed is very nice indeed, and that can get you out of harm's way, and this mobility does feel a lot nicer, as you'll see in the gameplay. And what does it do in terms of the gun handling and DPM? Well, I now have a aim time of 1.92 seconds, an accuracy of 0.26, a DPM of 4,523, and I reload in 5.84 seconds. So that's it in terms of the stats of the T-55 Enigma. We're now going to head over and have a look at the armor profile in the garage and see where the weak points are of this tank if you're coming against it in battle, and how to angle it if you are playing this tank. So I'll see you over there in a bit. So we're into the garage, into the armour viewer, having a look at the armour profile of the T-55 Enigma, and as with many different Era 2 vehicles, there's layers upon layers of that composite armour, explosive reactive armour that protects against heat, ATGM and HE ammunition. So I'm going to do my best to give you the weak spots of this tank if you're coming up against this thing on the battlefield, and how to angle it if you are playing this tank. So we're going to start going through these different armour layers. There's so many different layers, but the first thing I want to mention is this 200mm plate here below the gun, and the kind of turret ring directly below the gun. 200mm, that's easy penetration if this thing's face hugging you, or it's sort of mid to close range. It's quite hard to hit at long ranges, and don't fire ATGMs or anything like that or heat, because it will probably get absorbed by the gun or the space armor to the left and right of the turret. And as we move further down the armour thicknesses here, you'll see here that the thickest part of the armour on the outside of the space composite armour on the turret is 198mm thick, and then there's slats of 190mm inside that. And here again 180mm, you'll again see in these layers upon layers on the front of this tank, meaning that this frontal turret armour is extremely strong. The 180mm slats go to this front portion of side composite armour that is kind of just at the front half of both sides of this tank, and that's extremely effective against ATGMs, heat and HE, and very good for side scraping like this. When you side scraping at a shallow angle like this, that means that you're going to get a lot of shells absorbed, and even shooting into this big block of spaced armour is going to absorb a lot of APF SDS rounds with pretty mediocre penetration. And then we go on to the slats on the back of this composite slab that's attached to the back of the turret that protects against heat, ATGM and HE, and that's attached to the turret so it moves with the turret. If something's behind you, you can try and bait people into shooting back of your turret, and they'll hit that and get their shell absorbed, because if they hit the back of this tank, you're most likely going to get set on fire, because this thing goes up like a tinderbox. The next thing I want to mention is these slabs here that I've already mentioned are at the front of the left and right of this tank. The front and the bottom slats are 147mm, and then you have those slats in between it, so it's a very thick portion of composite armour here. It's a shot trap, extremely good for side scraping like this. Don't over angle, because they can penetrate the 80mm of side armour this tank has, but side scrape like this, try and bait people into shooting ATGMs into here and your upper plate, and you should be golden. Just keep the front of this tank facing the threat that you're going to be facing. The strongest part of these cupolas here, which are two weak spots, is 130mm, and they are quite easy to hit if you're above it or looking directly at it, but when you're below it like you are here, they can be quite hard if this thing is wiggling its turret. So that's one of the weak spots to hit if you can't hit its lower plate or you can't get round to shoot its side armour. There's lots of different layers upon layers of space composite armour over the upper plate, over the sort of sides of the turret and the front portion of the sides. The actual sides are 80mm, but bear in mind that front portion does have that massive slab of composite armour, so if you're going to shoot it from the sides, shoot to the rear part of the sides or the rear of the turret, especially with ATGMs, because otherwise it's just going to get absorbed. And as we go through, you're going to see plenty more layers on the back of this slab here, on the back of the turret, but also across the front of the hull and the front of the turret. The lower plate is quite easy to penetrate. It's not as well angled as the upper plate. So lower plate, cupolas, the rear portion of the sides, or the actual rear of the tank, and you should be golden to penetrate this tank. But that's really all that's to be said about this tank. You've got to keep this frontal portion towards the threat. If you're shooting at this tank, you want to shoot the lower plate, the cupolas, the rear portion, or the sides. The rear sides or the rear of this tank, I should say. If you're playing this tank, side scrape out like this. Don't give them that rear part of your 80mm. Try and bait people into shooting that massive slab of composite armour, and try and get people to shoot it with ATGMs and HE and heat, because it will get absorbed. Try and get people to ricochet off your frontal hull armour. Try and avoid exposing your lower plate. Go on to low profile ridges, just expose your turret. Try and wiggle to get people to miss your cupolas. try and move your gun in front of people's guns when they're face-hugging you to avoid people shooting at 200mm of armour below the gun, and that's kind of it really. Once people get around you, it's easy to take out, but frontally it is extremely strong for a medium tank. But that's it in theory. Let's see how this tank performs in practice in the 3 gameplays, and we're going to head over to the first one now. So we're into the first gameplay of today's video. We're here on Alamein in a standard battle with the T-55 Enigma, and we're going to try and head into a position down the south of the map to try and spot the enemies coming in from the south. We're going to head down the 1 and 2 line, and hopefully we'll get some early assistance if we manage to get into position. You can see the pretty damn slow mobility of the T-55 here. We're on soft terrain, and this is with the mobility equipment. Remember, it would be a hell of a lot slower if we weren't using the mobility equipment, and it just means that I can get into position as quick as possible to try and get some spots for myself, some early assistance, and try and get a good overview of where the enemy team are going to be going. And you can see me here trying to find the lowest profile ridge to hide the hull and just expose the upper part of the upper hull and the turret to the enemy, and we're going to try and get some early shots in as they advance into position. We get a nice shot there on the Leopard 2AV, which I believe is on sale in the store, which is a very good alternative tank to choose, although that is a heavy tank. You can see here that once tanks get above you and they shoot down onto your hull, then it does become pretty weak, so you do want to try and deter people from getting above you, and you want to be on a sort of level platform, and it makes your angled upper plate and your turret exceptionally strong, and your components are pretty hard to hit with the composite armor that we looked at in the armor viewer. So we're just going to be in this position for a while. I do have a bank of tanks behind me, but I'm not feeling particularly comfortable because they are trying to put a sort of pincer maneuver here. So I pop my smoke consumable, which I run. Sometimes I've been tempted to swap out for the enhanced whole patch kit or something like that, or even combat rations to boost the DPM, but I find that using it there just to stop the ATGM coming in from that Sheridan means that we can fall back a ridge, and we can hopefully have some more support from our teammates and beat the enemy over. I get a little bit frustrated at this point because I had a run of really bad games where people just weren't going forward, but you can see in this game the durability of the T-55 Enigma, and that the armour can be pretty effective. It's definitely not always reliable, but for a brawling sort of heavium, a brawling medium tank, it is pretty useful. You can see there the shell velocity is pretty nice at mid ranges, although that's, I guess you could say that's pretty close, but it's nice for leading your targets. It doesn't matter too much. We're getting shot in the rear now, and I'm just trying to think about where the hell I want to go. I'm just trying to get to a position where I'm covered from the sides and the rear, and I'm just frontally facing, because once the tanks do get the sides of your tank, it does become pretty weak indeed. So we've tried to escape, but there's a lot of tanks there that would have had our side, so we're going to decide to use the great reverse speed of this tank and reverse out, keeping our frontal armour towards the majority of the enemy, and we're going to come back here and we're going to use this hard cover to our left and just try and give our frontal armour to our opponents and side scrape off this rock. We've lost a substantial amount of hit points. You can see I got frustrated there putting the game. I don't like to do that, but I guess it was just one of those moments where I was trying to get some gameplay and everything felt like it was going wrong, and then I had this game which kind of felt like it was the turning point with this tank. It felt like it dug in pretty well, and I got a good grips. I got to grips, I should say, and got a good feel of how this tank can be pretty beneficial, although it can be quite a frustrating tank to play in comparison to quite a lot of the other Era 2 premium tanks that you can choose from. So we're popping out here in between the reloads of our opponents because we've lost so many hit points. I don't want to take shots unless I can help it. I'm using the hit points of my teammates that have sat back on the ridgeline at sort of E1, E2 area, and we're going to come out and get shots in. It's quite reliable shots, obviously, at this close range, and also that fast firing 100mm gun and this pretty decent DPM, you do boost up the damage pretty quickly. So ATGM comes in from my favourite era 2 premium tank, and I know how dangerous that tank is, so I want to push forward, risk getting shot once more just to put an extra round into him so he's a one shot. And that's always a good tactic to do, is to focus the more dangerous tanks and the tanks that you know you can either get out of the game, that you can penetrate, and that can influence the game later. You can see there that penetration's fine to go through the turret there. It is pretty low, but you can make it work if you know what you're shooting at and where you are shooting. And now we're just going to be advancing with our teammates. We've already lost enough of our hit points, but we managed to dig in there, side scraping off. We've bounced 920 damage, 4.7k of our own. Stopped there for a little bit, auto aim lazily. That was just the the mood in this game, I guess. I was just fed up, and I was just like, I'll sod it, let's just see what happens. Fortunately for us, we managed to dupe that Magak 5 round. Our second shell tracks him, so we get a penetrating shell and some more assistance. Now it's just this last remaining heavy tank. We are at one shot, so I'm not going to get killed if I can help it, but I'm going to try and get a shot in if I can to boost up my damage. I noticed that he is looking for me, so I'm just going to let this distraction work for my teammates. I'm not just going to feed him my tank for the sake of it. He's still looking at me, and yeah, he gets taken out by our leopard. Our leopard 1, and that's it for that game. Nothing absolutely spectacular, but I wanted to start off with that one because I felt like it showed a good example of this tank can dig in, side scrape. It can bounce enough shells to keep you in the game, and we actually ended up in second on that team with 394,000 silver profit, 5.6k direct damage, 2.1k assistance, and 920 blocked in a pretty decent game to start off this review. So now we're going to head on into the second gameplay and see what else we can get up to. So we're into the second gameplay of today's video, and we're here on Halfaya Pass, another desert map with soft terrain, and you can get another feel for how sluggish this tank is even with the mobility equipment. This is the first time that I've actually had this map on my channel since it was reintroduced in its new format, so I'm still trying to sort of find my way around the newly formulated map, and I know there's lots of different heights to this map. It seems to be sort of low to mid to high from left to right when you come in here from the north spawn, so I'm going to go sort of pretty central where I know there are flatter parts of this terrain where I can use 5 degrees of gun depression, and that's basically what you're going to want to be doing in the T-55 Enigma, is trying to find positions you know that you can shoot down on, like here on this sort of middle plateau here in the centre of Halfaya Pass, and we're going to see if we can make 5 degrees of gun depression work, because it is quite frustrating. As I've already mentioned, I really don't like tanks with poor gun depression unless they have something really remarkable. I'm still undecided whether I like this tank or whether I think it's just absolutely terrible and I'd just much rather play another tank. If it was me personally, I'd probably play a light tank. I just prefer that kind of gameplay, but for a medium tank with heavy armor, I guess it does work, and I'll let you know my full thoughts when we get to the third and final gameplay. But we've come here to this position in F6. There is the T-72 to our left. I'm going to try and use the terrain here to boost my tank up to get a shot in, but I know by doing that I'm just going to give the side of my turret to the enemies straight in front of me, and now we're going to go forward and see if we can get some shots into this light tank. I know that I've got the frontal armor to block ATGM damage, and we're going to see if we can take out this object 934. He's coming after us. He only does a very minuscule amount of damage. We get a second shell here and he gets blasted, and now he's on 1 hit point, and I'll take that all for myself, thank you very much. And within a pretty short amount of time we're up to 1.3k damage, and we're pushing the assault, and I found that this is just the best way to play this tank. It's just to push forwards when you know you're on terrain like this where I'm just exposing my turret. I'm going to move quickly, don't give the enemies too much of my lower plate or any of my weak spots like my cupola to shoot at, and don't be too stationary for too long. And we're going to use our teammates' shots and distractions to advantage. I go forward there trying to save the light tank there, but fortunately with his help we actually take him out, and now we're just going to go forth and see if we can flank this heavy tank that's down there in J J8. Yeah, my eyesight's working just about, but we've picked up 2.4k damage. We spot this Type 82, which was one of the tanks in the comparison, and we're going to come in here and see if we can help out our friendly medium tank. We try to go for a tracking shot there, but we go in for a ram. We've got a lot of composite armour, which means we are going to be slightly heavier than we should be for our size profile, so you can do some substantial amounts of ramming damage. And it also meant that we tracked that tank in place. We go for the tracking shot on the T-52 M1, which wasn't in our comparison but does have the same name without a hyphen. Yeah, all very confusing, but we tracked that tank in place. You can see the fast firing 100mm gun meant that we do get that lovely assistance. I ping a little shot off the Magak 5 just because he stopped in front of me. That was just more for my amusement than being frustrated. I was having a good run with this tank at this point, and I was kind of getting to grips with it after a pretty hard start to this session that I was playing earlier, especially with all the bugs that were going on with the update, which hopefully they will fix later in a patch. But you can see here that the mobility of the T-55 Enigma going up slope is extremely hard to deal with when you're trying to get the last remaining hit points in the battle. It can mean that you miss out on a few extra shells if you don't use this mobility setup. You could of course boost your DPM and things like that, but I want to try and choose the fastest route down here now. I'm going to try and pick up some speed downhill, and I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to use my frontal armor. We've still got sort of 3/4 of our hit points left, and I want to use them all up if I have to, but see if I can bounce some shots as well. Try not to block that light tanker. We're going to go forward here and see if we can get stuck in with our DPM, and once this gun does get singing, you do find that you rack up some good amounts of damage. We're going to come up behind these tanks here. Unfortunately, we do lose a lot of our speed coming up this really steep incline here, and it means that we're going to have to fully expose over the top of this ridge to get any shots in because of the 5 degrees of gun depression. There's a dead tank blocking our shot there on the Magak 5, which means we're just going to have to push forward and get a shot there on the Leopard 1A5. And now I'm just trying to pick my targets. At this point I am being greedy. They're all in a platoon together. If I wiggle around, I'm going to block enough shots to keep me in the game until my teammates come for support. And now I'm just going for damage at this point to boost up my silver. I really should be taking out the lower health hit points, but we're enough in the lead that I know that it was just going to work out anyway, and that fast fire in there meant that we picked up the second kill in quick succession, and now it's just a chase to try and find the armadillo. And I really won't bore you with this chase on the armadillo because it takes ages, and we basically circle the map, and eventually we do find him, and I'll get to you at the end screen. So we finally did catch up with our armadillo. We didn't get anything else out of the game, but we did finish in the MVP slot on our team with a first class 1452 base experience points, 4 kills, 6k direct damage, 2.1k assistance, and 460 damage blocked, with a nice silver earning of 417,000 silver with a ×2 silver booster. So that's it for the second gameplay. We are now going to skip forward to the third and final gameplay of today's review. So we're now into the third and final gameplay of today's video, and we're here on Fredvang, a nice open map, but it's going to be again pretty difficult for us to find positions to use the 5 degrees of gun depression, and a lot of positions that you've been using for a while with many different tanks. Unless you play tanks like the T-62 M1 with that 3 degrees of gun depression, it means that you're going to be struggling to use the 5 degrees, but we're going to see what we can make work. We're going to head towards the big cliff in the northern part of the map, or the sort of lighthouse area, and see if we can win that for our team, get the high ground, and then we can shoot down on our opponents and use the high ground to negate our pretty terrible gun depression. Again, you can see here that we're just getting up to speed, and once you get up to speed down this slope, we're going to be getting into position around the same time as we would in something like the Magak 5 or the M60A1 Rise, and we're going to see if we can get some assistance on tanks on top of this hill. Unfortunately, we didn't get there and spot that MOBA, and he sat in the open of all our light tanks that were bashing him with the ATGMs, and he isn't going to be around for much longer. I was hoping to get the killing blow in, but he gets taken out by the Leopard 1A5, and we're already up by a tank before we get into position. You do have to think a little bit more carefully in this tank than other tanks that are more mobile about where you want to go, because sometimes you will be stuck there for the game because you are unable to get across the terrain without exposing yourself or getting taken out in the middle of an open area. But here we should be in a good position just to expose our turret and our upper hull. Again, I've lost the ability to speak. I was just having a quick look around there to see what tanks were below me, whether there was a tank actually to my side, and I just haven't realised. And we're going to see here if we're able to get a shot in on that light tank. Again, the gun depression was an issue there. It just meant that I would have to reverse all the way down the hill, so we're going to focus on the tanks directly in front of us. We're going to keep our frontal armour to our opponents because of that massive block of spaced on the composite armour on the side or the front side of your 80mm of side armour. It is quite a good tank for side scraping if you don't expose the rear part of your side armour for too long, and tanks can get through that if you over angle. But when you're just angling around a corner at quite a sort of steep angle, it can be good at side scraping, as well as this kind of position here where we're hull down against this Chieftain Mark V. It's going to be a fantastic position. All they've got is to shoot at our turret, and they've got to hit our cupolas or sort of directly under our gun to have a chance of going through, whereas we can pretty much go through the whole of that Chieftain's turret, and we can aim for the cupolas as well, because this gun at this kind of range is pretty damn good with this DPM. And we're going to try and push the tempo now, because on the minimap we have noticed there are tanks in C5 and D5, and they're probably going to be coming up and flanking me. So if I take some shots here, it's worth it for the chance to progress the battle, and also to stay in and keep our frontal armour to the tanks that we are facing. This Maguk 5 comes in, he's probably going to put one shell into us, but he hits our spaced armour and that gets absorbed, and we're getting all the lovely assistance for spotting him out, and we've just got to try and find a position to see if we can get a shell into him and maybe go back to where we just were and shoot at the tanks that were trying to flank us. And it's all about keeping your chunky frontal armour to your opponents. That big block on the back of your turret will help you for tanks that surprise you. However, there's not too much you can do sometimes. You've just got to keep the armour to the biggest threat, especially tanks that have ATGMs, and especially tanks that have ATGMs and autoloaders. They can be very dangerous when they are circling you, so keep wiggling, try and get them to shoot into your spaced armour and bait them into the composite armour, and you should be golden. It's a brawling medium tank, this tank. If you played a World War II game, it's kind of like an Object 430U, a tier 10 Soviet medium tank. It's got armour, it's got that survivability, it's got a pretty decent gun that does chunk your opponents down fairly quickly, as you can see we are doing here on the FE4-211. Always aim for the tracks, get that lovely assistance, and yeah, you can see here that the view range is working pretty well for us on the T-55 Enigma. We're spotting all of these tanks out, getting some pretty juicy assistance. We've picked up a lot of damage in a short space of time, and now it's just one enemy heavy tank left, which we're going to use our boosted mobility to try and get behind. But yeah, that's what this tank's all about. Frontally facing your opponents, giving them your turret or your sloped back upper plate, trying to avoid them hitting your cupolas below your gun and your lower plate, trying to avoid tanks getting around you, keeping the composite armour towards ATGMs, and yeah, you should be golden. It's still a pretty good silver earner regardless of how well you play in this tank, unless you obviously don't do any damage at all. But again, we finished that game in the MVP slot with 4 kills, 6.4k direct damage, 3.4k assistance, and with a ×2 silver booster, 549,000 silver. So that's 65% silver booster, doing good work, or silver bonus I should say, doing good work. But it's an okay tank. My overall opinion on this tank and whether I think it's a good level 100 reward, I think it's kind of a bit 50-50. I wouldn't say it's one of the best, but it's definitely not one of the worst. It's completely fine. I went for the season pass. I wanted the Cobra as I do play a lot of World War II as well as Cold War, but if you're purely a Cold War player, getting the 2000 gold season pass is still pretty worth it for this tank and all of the other rewards you get. You get your silver back, and yeah, I can't say it's a bad deal at all. But I hope you've enjoyed this review of the T-55 Enigma. Thank you all so much for your support, and until next time, I'll see you on the battlefield, and bye for now.